probably millions, because you've got to include the man who was growing coffee in Brazil to feed the man on the oil rig who was drilling for oil, whose oil would be used to make the plastic, etc., etc. They were all involved in this cooperative enterprise to make me a computer mouse. They were all working for me. In the old days, you got rich by having people working for you, quite literally. Louis XIV, it's a fair bet he didn't make that silly outfit for himself. Louis XIV had 498 people to prepare his dinner every night. But here's a bunch of tourists going around his palace in Versailles. And each of them, when you think about it, has 498 people preparing his dinner tonight. They're working in bistros and cafes and restaurants and shops all over Paris, but they're ready at an hour's notice to drop everything and produce a meal for one of these people. They're working for him in just the sense that people were working for Louis XIV. Now, other animals have the habit of working for each other too, particularly the social insects, where the workers work for the queen and the queen works for the workers. But there's one big difference. In social insects, it only happens within the family, because that's what a colony is. It's a big family where everybody's related to the queen. And they have a reproductive division of labor. That is to say, they also work for each other in terms of reproduction. They delegate reproduction. That's the one thing we are not comfortable doing. It's the one thing we like to do for ourselves. Even in England, we don't expect the Queen to do our reproducing for us. And of course, what that means is that we've extended this process to working for strangers, whereas in the ant colony, you only work for members of the colony. And if you think about it, farming is also a division of labor that's extended to other species. In this picture, the shepherd is working for the sheep, and the sheep are working for the dog, and the dog is working for the man. They're all working for each other. They're all raising each other's standard of living by specializing in what they're good at. So when did this happen? When did we start exchanging things? The best way of finding evidence is to find archaeological evidence of objects moving long distances. Because we know from modern aborigines, like modern hunter-gatherers like aborigines in Australia, that when you see hand axes moving long distances in Australia, it's because of trade, not because of migration. And when does this first happen in the human fossil record? And the answer is around 120,000 years ago. That's, by the way, 10 times as old as agriculture. Trade is 10 times older than agriculture. The first thing you see is obsidian hand axes in Ethiopia start to move long distances from the volcano where they've been quarried. But about the same time, you see these shells, which are clearly being used as beads, moving up to 100 miles inland in Algeria from the sea. And that looks like it's the beginning of people exchanging things with each other across boundaries. And it must have been very difficult to evolve, because remember, up until that point, like chimpanzees today, no two males from neighboring bands could meet without trying to kill each other. And yet we've tried trading with each other instead. The effect this has is that human technology, the sophistication of human technology, depends upon the size of the population that's involved in the exchange. In the Pacific before Western contact, fishing tackle like this was more sophisticated on islands that had bigger trading networks than on islands which were more isolated. That is to say, the more contact you had with other people, the more sophisticated technology you could produce. So there's a kind of collective brain phenomenon going on here, that what determines the amount of technology we can produce is not how clever we are, but how much we're in contact with other people. And you can even see that what happens when you isolate people, as happened, for example, in Tasmania, when it became an island 10,000 years ago. Until that point, it was a peninsula off the southeast corner of Australia. What happened after that was not just that the Tasmanians had a slower progress of technology than the mainland Australians. Their technology actually went into reverse. They gave up a number of technologies that they had inherited at the start, in particular bone tools. They gave up how to make them. It wasn't because they were becoming stupider. It was because their collective brain was too small to sustain the specialization and exchange necessary to keep technology evolving. And as a little check, a little cross experiment, Tierra del Fuego did not suffer this. Why not? It's a similarly inhospitable island with a similarly small population of hunter-gatherers. Well, the answer is because Tierra del Fuego is separated from South America by a very narrow strait, the Magellan Strait, whereas Tasmania is separated by the Bass Strait. And there was continuous trading contact across the Magellan Strait throughout this period, so Fuegians were drawing upon a collective brain the size of South America. Go back to this image again and ask yourself not just who made the mouse for me, but who knew how to make a mouse? And the answer is nobody. There is no person on the planet who knows how to make a computer mouse. That might seem a rather rude thing to say in the Bay Area, but it's true. The president of the computer mouse company doesn't know how to make a mouse, he just knows how to run a company. The person on the assembly line doesn't know how to make a mouse because he doesn't know how to drill an oil well. And you need to drill an oil well to get the oil out to make the plastic and so on. The knowledge of how to make most of our technologies is distributed collectively across society. It is not held in individual brains. That, by the way, is why I'm not very interested in IQ and the debate about whether one group is cleverer than another. What counts is not how clever people are, but how well they're communicating. And that, by the way, is, of course, why central planning doesn't work, because you're asking one person to be cleverer than the collective knowledge of many people. I have, of course, just been quoting from a famous essay by an economist called Leonard Read called I, Pencil, in which he pretends to be a pencil and tries to understand his own origins and concludes that nobody knows how to make him even though he got made. And I think that's the magic of human technology. Of course, we've now connected our brains so that ideas can meet and mate faster than ever before thanks to the internet. And if you take a picture of the internet, it looks like a brain. It is a brain. We're nodes in its neural network ourselves. And we cannot but be accelerating the rate of human innovation as a result. So perhaps that $100,000 to $200,000 estimate of GDP in the year 2100 per capita might even be an underestimate. Well, okay, we're better off, but are we healthier, happier, cleverer, kinder, cleaner, more peaceful and more equal? Yes. We're healthier. We're living about 30% longer than when I was born. Life expectancy is increasing globally at about 5 hours a day. That's because we're defeating premature mortality. This is data from Britain, but you can see the collapse of infectious disease, of respiratory disease, and more recently of strokes and heart attacks, circulatory disease. And you can see the non-appearance of a cancer epidemic that would shorten our lives, as many environmentalists thought it would in the 1960s and 1970s. And you can even see on, this is US data, that cancer is beginning to fall. We are beginning to win against cancer. We're cleverer. IQ's going up in all countries. Nobody quite knows why. It's called the Flynn effect. It's going up about 3 points a decade. It's probably because we're getting to poor kids who used to be sick and not get proper nutrition, and we're making sure they get it, something like that. We're happier. Most people think there's no correlation between happiness and wealth, but it's not true. There is, both within countries and between countries and within individual lifetimes. The happier you are, on the whole, the more likely the wealthier you are, the more happy you are. It's not a linear correlation. And of course, you can be very rich and unhappy, but that's a good thing because it makes the rest of us happy. We're kinder. This is donations to charity as a proportion of GDP in the UK. I'm sure it's the same over here. On the whole, it's going up. We're cleaner. Air pollution is on the way down, so is water pollution in nearly all of the Western world, and it's getting worse in places like Beijing. But on the whole, we know that as you get richer, it is possible to start cleaning up your environment. A car produces about 90% less pollution in terms of volatile organic compounds, carbon monoxide and nitrogen oxides, as it did in the 1970s per mile traveled. This wasn't expected. Life magazine said in 1970 that by 1985, air pollution would have reduced the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth by half. We're more peaceful. We're less likely to kill each other than at any time in history. The 2000s was the decade with the smallest number of deaths in war since 1945. Most people find that hard to believe, but that's because we live in countries which did have a rather bad decade for war deaths in the last decade. But globally, fewer people died in that decade in war than in any previous decade since the Second World War. We're more equal. Inequality's falling. It has to be falling when you think about it, because poor countries are getting rich faster than rich countries are getting rich. So they're catching up. So Indians and Chinese are getting rich, whereas Americans are not getting rich nearly as fast. And that's bound to reduce global inequality. Can this go on? Am I just the man who, falling past the second floor of the skyscraper, says, so far, so good? Well, I'd like to point out that we've been expecting it to come to a horrible halt for a long time in the past. We've had all sorts of reasons to fear that Armageddon was just around the corner. This is a new tool from Google enabling you to count the number of mentions of a particular word in books over time. And the yellow line is the mention of the word eugenics, which peaks in the early 20th century. And remember, this was a real scare at the time. Everybody thought that the human race was deteriorating because of the overbreeding of the feeble-minded, and something must be done very urgently about it. And there were great big national commissions and things, and people like Winston Churchill and Theodore Roosevelt and George Bernard Shaw were determined that this was an urgent problem. And we didn't do very much. Well, we did a little bit too much about it in some countries, but you know, it turned out not to be the problem that people expected. Fluoridation. Do you remember the poisoning of our bodily fluids that was going on in Dr. Strangelove? The word nuclear war peaks in the early 60s and again in the 80s. The phrase population explosion peaks in the 70s. The word pesticide in the 70s and 90s. Acid rain peaks in the late 80s and 90s. The Y2K computer bug. Do you remember that? That was going to bring civilization to a grinding halt on the 31st of December 1999. GM foods, and of course, most recently, climate change. And my point is simply that, with the exception of the last one where the jury's still out, all of them proved incapable of preventing the inexorable improvement of human living standards. All of them were, in a sense, false alarms. Take population, for example. Many people think population is still out of control in some sense. It's not. The rate of population increase has been falling for a long time. It was 2% in the 1960s, it's 1% today. The absolute number of people added to the world population has been falling now since the 1980s, for 20 years. And this isn't because we adopted the policy recommendation of most experts in the 1960s that we would have to go for coercion, that we would have to pass laws about how many children people could have. Well, one country did that, but the rest of us didn't, and we saw just as rapid a decline in the birth rate. Why? Because of benign factors, because essentially we got rid of child mortality in most countries, and therefore people began to plan smaller families, because people got richer and better educated and decided to invest in quality of children rather than quantity through education, etc., etc. These are the reasons, and they're all nice reasons, they're not nasty reasons. But can we really feed a population of 9 billion people, which we will have by 2050? And it'll peak, according to the United Nations median projection, at about 9.2, 9.3 in about 2070. Don't hold me to that. We're bound to find that's wrong, either up or down. But can we really feed that number of people? Well, at the moment, we need a large proportion of the Earth to feed 6.9 billion people. So if we add another 2 billion people and we enable them to eat chickens and pigs and all these things that we like to eat, then we're going to need a lot more land. Now, it would be nice to do all this organically, but the problem with that is we're going to need a lot more land for the cattle whose fertilizer is going to be, whose manure is going to be used as fertilizer, etc. So we're going to need even more land. If we were using the mostly organic farming technologies of the 1950s today, we would need approximately twice as much land to produce the same amount of food as we produce today. So let's not do that. And let's treble yields. If we treble yields in farming,